Right, so big video today. We're going to be talking about the King's Indian defense and very specifically 22 ideas you must know about it. This is going to be very useful for you if you either play the King's Indian defense on the black side or you play 1d4 c4 from the white perspective and also want to learn a bit more about the opening. But with that all being said, this video is going to be split into 5 different parts, and the first part we're going to be discussing is the so-called exchange structures, where in these positions when black say plays a move such as e5, white decides to take on e5, resulting in the following pawn structure. And this structure is incredibly important to understand as the King's Indian defense player, because in many variations you're going to want to play this e5 break, counterattack white's d4 pawn in the center, which inevitably will also allow white this chance to take this pawn on e5. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, and a lot of the times, quite frankly, it is quite mediocre. But nonetheless, if you are going to play the King's Indian defense, this is a structure which you should be well acquainted with, which is why we're going to be diving into it first. And one of the first important things to understand is that very often when we play this e5 break, we are not overly concerned about white trying to grab another pawn on the e5 square, because we can simply play knight takes e4, win back a pawn and create a discovered attack on their knight on e5, meaning that if they take back whichever way we're going to take back, we're equal in material, and white no longer actually has the space advantage, which is one of the sort of defining characteristics that they so often have in the King's Indian defense. And in large part they already, which is quite important to understand, gave that up when they played d takes e5, and then further gave that up when they played knight takes e5, allowing this whole exchange, right? Which means when we look at these structures, generally speaking, the important theme to understand is that white is going to try and play for an initiative, and if they don't, positionally speaking, they could end up in a very sort of suspect situation. And the following game we're going to look at is a very good example of just how that can happen. The game continued castles, black played bishop g4, and this is the beginning of a very important idea to understand the whole exchange structure, which is that the d4 square is quite weak from white's perspective, and so if we are able to sufficiently weaken that even more and perhaps plant a knight onto that d4 square, generally speaking black is going to be very happy. And also furthermore, if we can control the d5 square and prevent white's knight from doing the same by jumping into a square like d5, we're going to be even more happy. And in this game, the player with the white pieces, he was around 1700 rated over the board. He more or less gave black everything they possibly could have wanted in this pawn structure. So black took, knight c6, bishop g5, knight d4, queen comes to e3. And again, as we were talking about just before, this knight, if it could come to d5, maybe white wouldn't be doing so bad, but now black plays c6 just in time. And not only has black got their knight on a really good outpost again, but this knight is restricted very heavily by this pawn now, and believe it or not, this already gives black a bit of a strategic edge in this position. And just to illustrate how kind of difficult this position can sort of be for white and how black has a fairly easy time improving their position while white doesn't, let's continue looking at the next few moves. Knight d7 happens, a very common maneuver, just sort of getting the knight out of the way, preparing to maybe come to the c5 square. White plays bishop e2, we go f6, the bishop bounces around a little bit, our other knight comes to c5, and very often it's going to come to a square such as e6 later on. But black even did without that in this game, played f5, bishop f1, white was quite passive at this point, we're thinking about maybe even playing something like f4, rook a8, and black has all their pieces in the game, and really this is the complete King's Indian dream. White's pieces are all sort of fumbling around, they don't have any clear roles, whereas black has all their pieces perfectly mobilized, very strong control of the dark squares. Once again, in particular this d4 square, it's incredibly difficult for white to really get rid of that guy, and even if they do by a miracle of chance happen to like play knight e2, which I don't think works, because like for one we could just grab a pawn, but hypothetically, like let's say they could actually exchange this knight without losing material, well our other knight is ready to come straight into the action and replace that guy like so. And so that example I just showed is a very good example of how easy it is for white to sort of drift into trouble whenever they enter this sort of exchange variation structure. However, I want to avoid painting a picture of all just doom and gloom. It's not necessarily all bad for white. And this sort of game is an illustration of one potential plan that white will very often pursue in this structure. So we have the following moves, rook e8, and at this point white in this game decided to take on e5. Black recaptured, white continues playing some fairly natural moves, queen c2, and this is a very important point where white decided to play this move b4, expanding on the queen side. And one of the key ideas is that we're not gonna, play something like b5. Sometimes we do, but that's quite rare. At the very least in comparison to pursuing another idea, which I'm gonna show right now, which is to play this move c5. And the whole point of this move c5 is that, for one, we're sort of clamping down on the d6 square like this. And what the implication of this is that very often white is going to be able to sneak our knight into a square like d2, then to c4, and then finally d6 at the end of all that. Sometimes the rook will also go in there, but of course our knight is much better intended for such an outpost than our rook. And it's quite difficult for, at this point, black to do much about it. They could say to bring a rook to the d file, we're going to play knight d2, they might do some waiting around like h6, but knight c4 now, and pretty much black has a choice. It's either allow knight d6 or they give up the bishop here or something like takes. But then we take back, and again we're quite happy in this sort of position. Sure, we didn't get our knight into d6, but we do get a very powerful bishop now along this long diagonal. And to wrap up this whole talk about the exchange structure, I want to talk also very importantly on the aspect of what happens when, say, black eventually plays e5, white takes the d pawn, and then decides to exchange queens. And I'm going to briefly show a game of mine that I played early in 2022 last year. I won fairly quickly, but it illustrates a very important idea of this whole exchange structure, which is that if white plays quickly and they are successful at doing so, it can be very dangerous for black. But at the same time, what you have to understand is that if black, especially when the queens are traded off, manages to consolidate once again, they can sort of plug up the d5 square for moves such as c6, they can start maneuvering their pieces around successfully. The position very often starts to become not so fun for the white pieces to really play. However, luckily in this game, my opponent didn't do such a good job of that. They, of course, noticed if they played c6 in this position that would probably run into just an immediate knight e4, putting some pressure along this diagonal. Black can't really defend f6, which means they're more or less forced to give up an exchange like this, which isn't particularly desirable. Which is why in the game, my opponent in this position, he instead played rook e8, getting out of this pin, which in many variations is a very logical idea, but unfortunately in this one just doesn't quite work because white can play not something like knight d5, because then after takes, black is probably doing fairly okay. Like if we take the bishop, they play c6, and if we take the pawn, maybe they can even play something like e4 and start opening their bishop up on this diagonal, block our one off. It looks quite interesting. But there was, again, a big problem with this whole move, which is that I could play knight b5 instead, pressure the c7 pawn. If black just pushes it, that's a pretty annoying fork, so he played rook e7 in the game, but then after rook fd1, he couldn't really defend the back rank, because if he does with a move such as bishop e6, there's another problem that he hangs the b7 pawn now because of my bishop on this long diagonal once again. And so after rook fd1, the game actually wrapped up in pretty short time. I played this very clever move, knight c7, actually deflecting the rook away, ensuring that I can win this knight, because okay, I could technically play rook d8 as well immediately and then get this sort of position where I'm up a pawn, but I just decided, again, you don't need to be paying too much attention to this. The whole concept I really just want to relay with this whole game is how incredibly careful black needs to be when entering. I'm just going to show the rest of the moves. In this position, my opponent resigned because, well, now at this point I'm one pawn up and it's going to be an extra pawn very soon. If they play rook c8, I can take, and then take, and voila, that's 2 pawns up. And if they instead go rook e7, bishop d6, well, they're going to be losing some material. But again, the whole point is that, you know, a lot of the times these exchange structures are not particularly dangerous for black, at least from a sort of more static strategic point of view. But if black doesn't carefully monitor white's initiative, like sort of happened in this game, like they have to, for example, play a bit of an awkward move such as either rook d4 or rook d7, getting out of this pin while also protecting the c7 square, and only then try to play a move such as c6. Whereas again, of course, in the game, after this whole thing happened, white was able to utilize their big lead in development and go for this very quick or knight b5 thing. But if I was even one move slow by playing something like rook fd1, again, it's incredibly important to understand that black could play c6, bring a bishop to e6, start maneuvering their pieces around, and white would essentially have no advantage. I would just put some moves on the board to further reinforce this whole thing. Maybe black will play h6. Already it's not so easy if like bishop e3, maybe we're going to get hit with knight g4. We don't want to take because then black has a bishop here again. And yes, we have these cute doubled rooks on the d file, but what are they actually doing? Not super obvious. And also, just to round out this whole queen exchange thing, it is important to note that sometimes it will just be straight up bad for black to allow it. For example, there are many opening lines in the King's Indian where white gets a bishop on g5, and this is called the averbakh variation, and it's well known that if black wants to play e5, they first have to play h6, kick this bishop away, and only then play e5, because if you do e5 immediately, there's this big problem that white can take, and then go knight d5, and black is defenseless to both these threats, so the sort of best move in this position is actually just to give up the exchange. Not something that you're probably dreaming of when you're, again, playing the King's Indian defense. Moving on to a more exciting part, I guess you could say, about the King's Indian, we're going to be talking about the Kingside attacks, which many people know the King's Indian defense for, actually. However, I want to throw in a bit of a disclaimer for this part of this video, that a lot of people, when they think of the King's Indian, they think of what I'm going to be discussing in this part. To them, this is like 100% or like 99% of what the King's Indian is about. Half of the YouTube videos, maybe like 90% of them that you'll find online about the King's Indian, is just going to be some like famous Bobby Fischer, Kasparov game or something like that, where black absolutely just annihilates white on the king side. And while this is a very important part of the King's Indian if you want to play it, it's probably only like 20-25% maybe, at least in my opinion, of what the King's Indian is really about. And I want to throw that out there because a lot of people might just watch this section of the video, try to implement all these ideas in like every King's Indian position they get because it just seems so fun, so why not, right? But what you have to understand, and I'm going to show this more throughout the video, is that in some positions, these ideas can work very well, but in others, if you're careless, they can backfire very badly. But nonetheless, getting straight into things in this section, so this is of course one of the most well-known theoretical positions in all of the King's Indian defense. We were discussing briefly in the last section structures like that can arise in such as the exchange variation, but say in this position castles is the main line, there's also d5, the so-called Petrosian variation where you close the center immediately, and typically how you're going to play as black in this sort of position is you're going to go for like something like a5, play knight a6, put knight on the c5 square, attack white's e4 pawn. But when white castles immediately, we're playing a little bit differently. We're going to play knight c6, put some pressure on the d4 pawn. d5 is the most common move, kicking our knight back to e7. And white has a couple of different approaches in this position, but one of the main ones is to play knight e1, with the idea that against black's eventual kingside plan where they go for this move f5, they're going to eventually reinforce that strong point on e4 by playing this move f3. And typically how black will carry on from such a position is they will go full forces ahead, they're going to play f4, something like bishop f2, g5, and start trying to ram these pawns up the board and create some serious attacking chances on the king's side. Now, I'm going to show some really cool attacking ideas from here on out that black can pursue in this sort of structure, but it's also important to understand that you can't, again, just blindly go for this sort of f5 break in every sort of position. For example, let's say you put the knight on d7 instead of c6, a playable line, but the positions are a bit different in their nature. And what you're going to have to understand because of that is if, say, white, like in these positions, because the knight's on c6, putting pressure on d4, white is a lot more free to sort of keep the tension with a move like rook e1. They're under no obligation to rush into taking or playing d5. And with this in mind, with this sort of constant pawn tension going on, it's incredibly important to understand that you can't just go for a plan such as knight e8 and f5 in this position. This is absolutely horrendous. And the reason precisely is that the pawn is on d4, not d5, which means that the center is actually fluid, it is open, not closed. Once the center is closed with a move like d5, that's a green flag. You are much more free to go ahead and pursue a plan like going for this whole f5 break. But when the center is not closed, white has not played this move d5, playing in f5 is really stupid because white can just sort of open the game up by exchanging a bunch of pawns. They can maybe play a move such as c5, now opening this diagonal. And given that black has spent the last few moves moving backwards with moves like knight e8, and white's far ahead in development, there's all these weaknesses exposed by these weakening moves like f5 in black's camp, such as the e6 square. For example, we want to play like knight ef6 or something, well, white could play a move such as knight g5, and immediately this weakness is being exposed. Which means if we were to come back to a position like this, we would probably have to play something more slow, maybe c6, maybe we could even take on d4. We're going to be discussing this structure later on in the video. This is called the open King's Indian structure, or at least that's what I call it. Or like white, we could also choose to continue keeping the tension with a move like c6, queen e7, rook e8, any number of moves, but you do not want to go prematurely for such a kingside attacking plan like this when the central structure is not yet defined. Coming back to this position, however, I now want to discuss some of the more deeper plans that lie within these positions. So we know that white's best move usually is to play something like d5, they push us away, we can go back to e7 now, knight e1, knight d7, and we briefly looked at something like bishop e3 and us going to f5, but they can also go for something like knight d3 in this position, we can play f5 again, and white could play something like f3, but there's also this very subtle move, bishop d2. White's kind of just saying that, you know, I'm okay not recapturing with the pawn, I'm also okay just recapturing with a knight. But interestingly enough, this is theoretically not so bad for black. They can play this move knight f5 and throw a knight into the d4 square later on potentially. The position is around roughly equal. Although it's worth noting that although technically by theoretical standards taking on e4 is supposed to be best, black can of course go for the typical sort of more attacking stuff as well, play knight f6, sort of force white to play f3. They usually don't want to take, because after g takes f5, now they've surrendered a lot of their central control. Perhaps something like e4. E4 we actually want to be careful about playing. Let's just say they play some random move like b4, e4, knight f4. Now this knight's in a very important outpost, so maybe you want to lay off the e4 stuff, but potentially something like f4, building their pieces up slowly to the point where they can create some sort of serious kingside attacking chances. Definitely not the most safe position in the world for white. Of course, coming back to, say, knight f6, f3, black plays f4, we're just going for our standard kingside attack and stuff. We're going to shove the pawns up the board. None of this is too special or new though. We are all fairly well aware of these ideas. And of course, while we're pursuing this, what white's going to do is try and do something on the queen side. You've heard the whole thing before, where maybe you haven't, but you're hearing it now, where our pawn structure is pointing this way, so we want to attack on the king side. White's pointing this way, so they want to attack on the queen side. And in this position, one very typical thing for white to do is bring a rook to the c file. And one thing that black has to brace for is that white is going to maybe go knight b5 and start shoving their pieces into black's territory. And we don't really want that, so we're going to do some stuff to prepare for that. Bracing for impact, we're going to play knight g6. Bringing the knight to the king side still, but there's also another more subtle idea behind knight g6, which is that we're sort of clearing the 7th rank now so that we can bring our rook here and actually protect the c7 square like so. And an even more cute idea behind this whole rook f7 thing is that, say in a couple moves time, bishop a5, this is all theoretical stuff, white's leaving their bishop hanging, but the point is that if we actually take their bishop, they get like all these very dangerous pawns and stuff. This isn't really a position we actually want to go into. So usually how black is going to respond to this sort of bishop a5 thing is we're going to take back. White's going to go back to b4 now, put pressure on the d6 pawn, and how on earth are we going to deal with this, right? And this is a cool idea that was sort of allowed by rook f7, which is that we can play bishop f8 now, protecting the d6 pawn like so. And also another very subtle idea is we're clearing the g7 square for our rook in the future, but potentially do some damage along the g file. And if white continues trying to crack down on the d6 pawn, we can play knight 8 in this position. It does sort of look like we want to play bishop d7, but again, this is one of those sort of materialistic, or shall I say non-materialistic things in this position where white's actually going to take. We of course can't take the knight because our queen's going to hang, so we're going to take this, and after takes, white is technically in exchange down for the pawn, but they have tremendous compensation for the fact that they now have this protected path d pawn. They've kind of broken the base of black's pawn structure. They gain all these tempi attacking our rook and whatnot. Not really a position that you really want to find yourself in as black. But after knight e8, you can sort of hold everything down for now and start once again going for this more kingside attack type stuff. So coming back to what hopefully is a somewhat familiar position by now, white plays knight e1, and in this game, instead of black going to knight d7, they actually went to this e8 square. And there are some pros and cons of each of these. d7 is a little bit more popular and considered, I guess, a little bit better by theory. But this knight e8 move also sort of has its benefits. One is that compared to some of the knight d7 variations, the d6 pawn is protected a little bit better eventually when white cracks down our pawn like they do in some variations, which by playing knight e8 you sort of addressed to some extent. However, the con is that compared to knight d7, now we don't really control the c5 square as much, so white can be a little bit quicker in how they deliver their queenside counterplay. Less in the following game, we had these moves, f3, f4, we had bishop f2, g5, all very standard stuff. Both sides are just sort of going at it right. Black brings their knight to the g6 square, b4, but white was sort of getting a little bit too adventurous with how they were pushing forward their pawns. Maybe they should have gone c5 and moved quicker, because now when this whole thing is finally delivered, black gets through g4 pretty easily, and white was just ultimately way too slow with how they were doing things. They played knight b5 in this position, a very typical move, trying to attack the a7 pawn, but again, it was just ultimately too slow in this position. Black got through g3, and this is an incredibly important idea that you want to understand in these sort of King's Indian structures where you're going all out on the king side. You don't really want to take on f3, you just don't. White's probably going to play something like takes, and in general they're doing pretty solid in these sorts of structures, so instead the way you want to go about it usually is trying to break through with this move g3, breaking through on dark squares. Dark squares is typically where black is also strongest, so it kind of makes sense to do that from this perspective. And if white takes twice, say in this fashion, what we're going to do is eventually play some sort of move like h4. In the game, black played a6 for us, that's also fine. Then played h4, bring the knight to h5, and again, notice black's sort of dominance on the dark squares. Everything is sort of aiming towards this sort of dark square complex, and even though, yes, black is technically a pawn down, it doesn't really feel that way because our attack is so strong. And ultimately, in sacrificing the pawn, we've just opened up more lines on the king side for us to ultimately accomplish our attacking goals. Switching colors briefly, one very important thing to understand about the Kingside Attack is how important black's light squared bishop is. And this may seem a bit random because we're talking about these very aggressive ideas and now I'm just bringing up this random piece, right? But you really have to understand and go deeper into some of these positions to really see how just important this bishop is along this diagonal in supporting the Kingside Attack. For one, like in this position for example, it very much does help with black getting through the g4 break. Without this guy, it would be a lot more difficult. And although at this point I think it's quite difficult for white to really stop black from getting that break in, for example, you don't really want to go h3 because, like, yeah, you defend the g4 square one more time, but if black just plays g4 anyway, you don't really want to end up with these double g pawns. It doesn't really feel like this is something that black is opposed to. They're still sort of opening up the king side. So what white did in this position is very instructive actually. They played this move a5 instead, clamping down the b6 square with the idea that now, okay, black, you can go ahead with your g4 stuff, but I'm going to play knight b6 now, and I'm going to attack your rook as well, but more importantly, the light squared bishop, I'm going to take that thing, and now in this position, okay, yeah, white has a bishop here, but more importantly, we've eliminated the light squared bishop, and that makes it very difficult for black to ever successfully crack through on the king side. Yes, they still might be able to somehow, but the difficulty of doing so has pretty much exponentially increased. Because again, if black takes like this, we're going to take back, not too clear what they do next. And if they play g3, one very important defining aspect of what we've just done in capturing the light squared bishop is that we can play h3, close the structure, and usually the way in which black will go about sort of continuing their attack in this sort of position where white play h3 is to give up their light squared bishop on the square and then hopefully be able to recapture with the queen somehow, or like maybe one of these knights by maneuvering them first around. But of course now it is clear that that is much more difficult to really achieve. And on that note, this is a position that illustrates the idea I was just talking about, which is that again we have this sort of structure. How is black going to break through? Well, look at this little cute guy here, our light squared bishop. We can use him to break through, and now black is just screwed. I mean, like, if they take it, we're going to take back, and the only way they can possibly defend against our maiden threat is to play rook f2. We're going to take that guy, and we're up a decent amount of material in this position. We hopefully should be winning this position. So now that we understand many of the important attacking ideas that can occur in the King's Indian defense, we sort of need to balance that out with this section, where there are going to be many positions we see that white delays castling a bit, and when white delays this castling, very often that also to a large extent nullifies many of the typical attacking ideas that black likes to go for in the King's Indian. So really make sure you pay close attention during this whole section, because you're going to avoid a lot of pain if you just try and again like use the same ideas in every single variation without understanding the sort of nuances. But anyways, to this position that should hopefully be rather familiar, black can castle and white goes bishop e2, e5, again all standard stuff. We were looking at the classical variation earlier, but one interesting thing that white can do actually is play the so-called Gligorich variation with bishop e3, and typically black's best replies are considered to be knight g4, e takes d4, and not knight c6, which many people actually fall into the mistake of playing. But the reason this is so bad is that when we play all the same moves, like, okay, if we castle, then this is fine for black, but the problem is we are not obliged to castle. We can instead play this move knight d2, which has a couple ideas, but for one, we actually stop knight g4, which is very annoying in many variations, harassing our dark squared bishop. But what this move also does is it prepares for our knight on the d2 square to eventually now come around to the queen side later on. Say, again, just all the same moves we'll see in the other variation, except our king was castled already. White can play c5, the knight is ready to come to the c4 square next, and this is an absolutely dramatic improvement upon the other positions we were just looking at, because with our king in the middle of the board, quite frankly, the chances of their kingside attack working is non-existent, while in the meanwhile, of course, our queenside stuff is well ahead of anything that, again, black is doing. We're very quick to target, say, their weak pawn on d6, the base of their pawn chain, and again, the Grigorich variation, this whole thing starting with bishop e3, which is what we were again just talking about, really just illustrates how the small difference of whether the white king is castled or not yet can really make a big difference in what move black should go for, and also the ensuing plans from a position that really makes sense for them, which in this case was not going for the kingside attack. Another variation which also illustrates it is one that I'm quite fond of. It's called the semi-averbakh variation. Earlier we talked about the averbakh variation a bit earlier with bishop g5 and how if black takes, they go e5 rather, we can just take a bunch of times, play queen takes d8, knight d5, and they're pretty much losing. But with the semi-averbakh, black can play e5, we go d5, and one very important thing to understand about these positions is that when we haven't yet committed the knight to f3, and black plays e5, this sort of introduces a bit of a twist into the position in that very often white's going to actually play this slightly weird looking move, at least if you've never seen it before, g4. But there's actually a very deep concept. We're not just throwing out a flank pawn and sort of, playing some weird sort of chess, right? We're actually sort of later down the line anticipating that black, because in the King's Indian very often they're going to want to play for a break such as f5. Well, in this whole line, where we've already played g4, it becomes a lot more difficult to do so, because if they do play this move f5, they're going to inevitably end up opening a lot of lines in front of their king. In this game, my opponent continued by playing knight c5, I played f3, a5, I played h4, again just sort of trying to expand on the king side. And one very important thing to understand actually is that it looks like I'm trying to absolutely nuke black on the king side and I'm trying to tear their head off. But in reality, while that is to some extent sometimes what white's trying to do, very often the white player is actually just content with not really trying to create any sort of real all-out balls to the wall attack on the black king, but actually just sort of restraining black's action on the king side, and then later on doing their own sort of expansion on the queen side, with the king side being closed, because again, in these sort of King's Indian positions, black's king side structure ultimately is pointing this way. So if we're able to sort of paralyze the king side and they're not really able to go f5, at least under favorable circumstances, well, the queen side isn't really where they're going to play realistically speaking, because that's where white's going to play, right? And to really illustrate what I mean with all this, well, in the game, my opponent actually gave me the perfect chance to illustrate it. Not that I really understood just how bad it was at the time, but as the game progressed, I was able to punish my opponent pretty well, and this really served as a bit of a foundation for just my understanding of how bad, it really can get if black tries to insist anyway on once again going for these kingside attacks when the circumstances just don't really align with it. Now f5, white takes, they take back, we exchange a bunch of times, and again, if the white king was castled on the king side, maybe this would be okay for black, but the king's in the center, right? Very, very different story. And just playing over the rest of the moves rather quickly, I played knight f3, queen h4 was played in the game, which was a bit of a weird move, especially because we don't even have to necessarily block like one may think at first. We can actually just move the king to d2, because again, what's our king really doing on the king side? It's not really going to live there, right? And it's really difficult for black to take much action in the center. Like if they play f4, well, that's kind of nasty. If they play f takes e4, knight g5, and all sorts of discovered attacks once again. So in the game, after a long fought, my opponent ended up playing queen e7. And by the way, at the time of this game, this is 2018. This was at the Australian Championships. I had a FIDE of around mid-1900 at the time. My peak was a little bit higher, but my rating had dropped recently. And my opponent was actually a FIDE master, I believe now an international master, closing on the Grandmaster title, so he's doing quite well. But this game, unfortunately, was not such a good showcase of that. I played Queen G1. I just sort of proceeded with this. There was some crazy stuff that happened just there, but ignore that. This was the final position we got. he resigned, and this is pretty much the picture perfect reason, or shall I say like goal maybe, of what white is aiming for when they go for this whole g4 thing. But elaborating more upon the point that we were just talking about of how, you know, it's not always just about creating these amazing flashy kingside attacks. Very often it's about playing like a bit of a python, restricting the opponent and sort of playing on both sides of the board. This game right here is a very good illustration of it, played by former world champion Tigran Petrosian. He played the Samish variation a lot actually with f3, and one of the ideas of the Samish actually is that black very often is sort of disincentivized to go for something like e5. It was very popular back in the time around like this game was played, but these days very rarely seen, for the reason again that these sort of structures where black tries to play in the fashion they would against a classical variation, it just doesn't really work that well, because again, this king has not yet castled. We can go for stuff like g4 and very heavily restrict the movement of black on the king side. And the game continued with black playing c5, actually really making the position a lot more closed, also sort of trying to limit white from playing the c5 break themselves. Not perfect, it has its pros and cons, we're going to be talking about this a bit later. And white continues, Petrosian pushing along on the king side, and black has a bit of a decision now, do they go for f5 or not? But ultimately Petrosian's opponent realized this is probably a bit risky, because again we exchange a bunch of times on f5, the light squares get weakened a bit, we get our bishop along this diagonal, we're gaining tempi and stuff, the e4 square is ours for this knight. Very dangerous position if you'll let it unravel for the next few moves. Say rook f8 is a possible move, knight e4, this pawn could be pushing, we could like move our king to the side, double up on the g file, there's all sorts of dangerous stuff that could really happen. So that's why Petrosian's opponent instead constrains himself to playing a bit more passively. But of course the problem with that is that when you're passive, you're not being active and you're letting your opponent be active. So yeah, not so great for black. But the way Petrosian played was just incredibly instructive. He just kept slowly improving his position, playing a5, and really going for this bind, or let's say attack on the king side, sorry, queen side rather, while actually on the next move, closing things up on the king side. And again, this comes back to the whole thing I was talking about earlier. We're not necessarily always going for a maiden attack on the king side. We're more than happy in this position that, like, realistically speaking, they're not going to be gained through f5, because look at all the control we have over that square. While in the meantime, we are going to go full speed ahead on the queen side, play b4, potentially break down c5 point. And the way Petrosian converted this, very instructive. But the conversion is probably for a slightly separate video. For now, just really look at this position, really understand it's bad for black, and understand this is something, if you're on the white side of the King's Indian, this is something you should be shooting for. But if you're on the black side, this is sort of like the absolute epitome of what you should be trying to avoid and steer right clear of. However, to show one example to sort of balance out some of the negative things, just to show it's not like all doom and gloom. This is one position which happened from a somewhat recent game between Luke McShane on the black side and Niels Grandelius on the white side, two very strong 2600 GMs. We see a line that is very popular. This is the Karpov variation, where white frequently aims in these positions, again like against any sort of e5 thing, to play g4 and sort of restrict or potentially attack black and the queen side in this sort of fashion. In this game we saw knight e6, but very quickly transposed back to the sort of territory we were just talking about, knight c5. And in some of these variations, going for a quick 98 sort of f5 thing, I've seen some people do it and it not work out terribly. But in this game, what Luke McShane did was he played c6, very quickly counterattacking the d5 pawn, takes, d7, trying to bring a rook to the c file. Perhaps we're not too scared of something like takes actually. And while I should note this has been like a possibility for a bunch of moves like all the way since here, but in general you're not too concerned about a move like this, because yeah, like, okay, we get double d pawns in this situation. It's not doubled, but they do get a protected past d pawn now. But the thing you have to understand is that, yes, there is that sort of strategic element to it, but there's also a very dynamic one in the sense that they've given up their very important dark sword bishop, which, with all their pawns being on light squares, is very strategically risky in its own sort of sense. So usually white's not going to do that. If they do, that's sort of good for us. But 92 happened, and black again played a very instructive move, h5, with one very key idea being to eventually, in the next few moves, clamp down on dark squares further with this move h4, stopping white from potentially expanding further. And also I should note this move knight h7 that happened. Usually you don't want to enter the structure, but there's a tactical nuance that allows it to work, which is that we can play queen h4 check and actually recapture on h5 with the queen, And now we're probably going to go to f5 next. This is a very satisfactory position for the black pieces. Also bishop h6, something we're looking to play, because yes, in a lot of positions where you have the encadred bishop like this, you don't want to exchange it off when it's in front of your king, because that can be quite weak. But again, from a more deep strategic point of view, if our king is not really going to be in any serious trouble, especially given the sort of more closed nature of the position, being able to exchange these bishops off is actually rather strategically desirable for the black pieces. And that's why in the game, actually, what we saw was black going out of their way to play this move bishop f6, which to many players would be like, ooh, what are we doing with this move? We're surely not going to try and exchange it off with a move like bishop g5, are we? But that's exactly what black is trying to do. We are not afraid, because I mean, realistically, if all these lines close, they're not going to really be able to punish the fact we're trading these bishops off. We eventually saw a trade of bishops occur later down the line with bishop e5, or maybe I should rather say an attempt at trying to exchange them, because after queen f6 in this position, white retreated. But nonetheless, this position after the queen exchange with all these sort of weak dark squares in the position, a very nicely centralized dark square bishop with full sort of eyes across the whole board, was indeed very promising for black, and later on he did end up going on to win the game. And sort of following up on this whole discussion about the g4 pawn break, what I'm going to show here is a very instructive way in which sometimes it can manifest itself, where we have the Petrosian variation this time, where white plays bishop e3. The main line is actually bishop h4, but there's sort of a dangerous strategic idea with bishop e3 in that if black just plays slowly with knight a6, white's again going to make use of the fact they haven't castles and play a quick like knight d2, knight c5, g4, and go for these sorts of ideas we were just talking about. But what I want to discuss here is what happens if black goes knight g4 themselves and goes for very quick f5. And although black is doing sort of objectively okay in these variations, these are all the best moves for them so far, there are some ideas they need to be a little bit wary of, which is, say, in this position after white plays queen c1, attacking the h6 pawn, black needs to be very careful to play this move f4 and not play the very natural looking move king h7, protecting their pawn like this, because now we're going to make use of the fact of the king's slightly awkward positioning on this sort of file now, and play this move g4, trying to rip open the center if they take. I mean, this is really going to end up pretty ugly, right? So it's very likely that black is going to try and sort of shut things down now with f4, but we're going to play a very quick queen c2 check, and after say king h8 long castles, we have very nice control over the light squares. If our queen is diagonal, we're not going to be gaining e4 anytime soon. Probably going to bring the rook over to g1 maybe, knight h4, throw this guy in there, h4, g5. That's dangerous stuff that black doesn't probably want to get themselves entangled into. But nonetheless highlights a very potent nature of a move like g4 very often in the King's Indian defense. But wrapping up this talk about the g4 pawn push or sacrifice, whatever circumstances it sort of unraveled itself onto, this position we have in front of us we've talked about a bit earlier, where black plays e5 immediately. But one very sort of tricky move is for black to maybe wait with something like knight d7 or knight a6, not yet committing to any sort of defined central structure, which can be useful because let's say knight a6 for example, if white now plays g4, well, yeah, black could play e5 and go back into this sort of position. But one tricky thing about knight a6, which the player with the white pieces has to be careful of, is that if you just carelessly play g4, and now it's not necessarily a terrible move, but you have to be very careful and be aware of the potential consequences that can arise in the following positions, which is that after c5 now, and you play d5, well, you're getting yourself into a Benoni structure where the center is not closed. That's very important. The center is not closed compared to these positions, because now g4, it's very difficult when you push a flank pawn to get punished for doing so because the center is closed, right? But if you put like this position on the board instead, well, the center is not closed because black can potentially play e6, e takes d5 and open things up, which now makes this move g4 look very out of place, and hence why when you play against a very flexible move like this, or as black you might consider playing in such a fashion, that you might want to revert back to like a more normal developing move like knight f3, because after something like g4, you know, black can utilize the fact that the center is still very fluid. It's like how we were talking about earlier, black doesn't always want to go for like, I don't know, like the e5, f5 sort of kingside center attack sort of thing. Sometimes the center is going to be more fluid, sometimes the king's still going to be in the center. You have to sort of adapt to what your opponent's doing to some extent. You can't just blindly whip out the same like 10 or so moves that you learned from some opening book in one very specific variation. You have to adapt to the situation. Alright, so 2 days later, we are here recording part 4. I tried recording this part yesterday, but then when I was listening over to it like an hour ago, I realized the audio sucks, so I'm re-recording it now. Hopefully this turns out good. But nonetheless, what the fourth part is going to be about is the so-called open King's Indian structure. And usually the way this structure occurs is, again, we sort of have at many points in the King's Indian this pawn tension between the d4 and e5 pawns. Usually what's going to happen at some point is either white's going to exchange, they're going to push, or black is going to take. And the structures we're going to discuss in now are the ones where, say after castles, black decides to play e takes d4, and here we have the so-called open structure. And one of the just important things you need to understand about this structure is, compared to say like the exchange one, where there's more or less an equal amount of space, white does have slightly more space for the c4 square, but that results in the weak d4 one. In this one, when black releases attention, it really does give white this more of a long-term space advantage with the e4 and c4 guys against the d6. Not quite a Maroczy bind. The Maroczy bind would be when there's a pawn on e7 instead of c7, but nonetheless it is quite resemblant of that. But the first key idea that I want to discuss in regards to this open King's Indian structure is the break that we're very often going to go for at some point, where let's say we start with rook e8. This is a very sensible move, force white play f3. Bishop f3 is a little bit awkward. The bishop, it just doesn't really work well in this diagonal. It's butting its head against this pawn e4. The c4 pawn is undefended now. Not really a big fan of this. So f3 is very logical, and usually the way black is going to continue, they could develop a knight c6. This is quite plausible, but even better is to play c6. And a key idea of playing c6 is in many lines what we're going to want to do is break very quickly with d5. And the thing you want to understand is that, just put some random move on the board, if we just exchange a bunch of times in the center, this is going to be a big win for black. We've neutralized white space advantage, and our pieces are very active. Our bishop is cruising along this long diagonal, not something that white really wants to allow. And say for example white plays a move such as bishop e3, this is already quite an inaccuracy because look at where we're placing the bishop. It's right in the eye of the rook on e8, which is just sort of asking for it with d5. And actually after c takes d5, you could play c takes d5, but an even cooler move is to play knight takes d5 now, saying that okay, if you take for the pawn now, well, I'm gonna take your bishop, and that's not looking so great. And so the best move is the knight takes d5, but after c takes d5, there's still a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. We're going to develop quickly with knight c6. Black is doing more than fine already in this position. However, coming back, of course, to this one that we were just looking at, you have to be careful to not always play just d5 on autopilot. There's going to be certain situations in which this is a bit premature, and the position we have in front of us right now is precisely one of those situations where if we play d5 immediately, white's going to take once, but they're not going to take twice. If they just keep taking, mindlessly doing so, then again, we're very active, we have no problems in this sort of position. Rather, what white is going to do is they are going to keep the tension, maybe not always, like depending on your level, right? You might not play someone who's strong enough to really properly navigate this position, but the objectively best move and one that poses a lot of difficulties to black is for white to simply play bishop g5. And the problem now is that if we just do nothing, well, of course, with the pin, they're just probably going to win the d5 pawn. And so for black, that means that likely the most logical move is for us to play d takes e4. But after numerous different moves, for example, even just f takes e4, piling the pressure up on the f file, things are starting to get quite unpleasant for the black pieces. Even the computer move, knight db5, offering a trade of queens, since now there's all sorts of annoying threats with the knight, which means that in this position, instead of going for this whole d5 thing, because with just how the position can develop, right, tactically it just doesn't work out because we're not developed sufficiently enough to really make this work, whereas white can. And also it's worth noting that if we were to take the analogous position with bishop e3 looked at earlier, why wouldn't something like this work? Well, now we can actually play queen b6, and this is one of the key ideas, right, of king h1. And also, I think one reason why maybe we do play knight takes d5 here, but even just taking this position, right, well, it's not so easy for white to take this, because now after takes, this is obviously an issue, and if they were to play bishop takes f6 first, well, again, this is still kind of problematic for them. But coming back to what I actually want to say was that after c6, king h1 in this position, that's why black, what they probably should do is not play d5 immediately, instead just play a developing move such as knight b7, and there's always potential to go d5 later down the road. A final note on the d5 break though, just covering one possible structure which could occur, and it's quite common, say in the Gligerich variation. Earlier we discussed how, in this position black could go knight c6, but you don't really want to go this way because this just leads to a very bad version of the classical variation, which even leaves, say, going knight f4, and you get these sort of positions where the position's quite closed and sort of has a bit of a weird feel. We've obviously put our knight g4, but now it's sort of hanging out here doing who knows what. We've played this f6 move, the bishop is on this diagonal. It's a very weird position, the King's Indian, and some people, they like it, but also many people like playing e takes d4 against a Gingrich, now going rook e8, f3, c6, and of course one of the key points is that white has to be a little bit careful. They can't just castle because d5, and this is looking relatively familiar, I hope, to some of you. And so in order to avoid this sort of situation, what white will usually do is play something like bishop f2, and against d5, the point is that they'll often play e takes d5, c takes d5 castles, and say, the point is if we just release attention, the bishop's quite active. So usually we'll just keep developing our pieces, say knight c6, but then after c5, again, white doesn't want to release attention carelessly like this a bunch of times. Black has no problems at all in some sort of position like this. Rather, what they will do is play something like c5, and these positions are very interesting. There's a obviously isolated queen's pawn the black has to deal with. There's a bit of a weak d6 square that perhaps a knight could sneak into. Although in some lines, pawn on c5 could also be weak. Sometimes we could sneak our bishop around the back entrance, try to attack the c5 pawn like that. Sometimes we also go for like knight h5, try to sneak a knight in there, put pressure on this diagonal. Like this is a theoretical position where black is sort of doing okay, but you do sort of have to be careful because if you're not, you're probably going to get positionally strangled. And I'm not going to go too in depth into analyzing this, that's probably a separate topic for another video, just because again, this is like a very specific thing, a very specific variation of the King's Indian defense, which you don't even have to go into if you didn't want to. You could always play knight g4, right? However, aside from just going for, say, the d5 break, which we discussed in this position does not quite work because white can play very accurately if, say, takes, and bishop g5, there's another break sometimes which black can go for, and the circumstances do need to sort of align themselves because you won't always be able to get this break under favorable circumstances. But one thing that is worth considering in a lot of these positions is this break where black eventually goes for f5. And the way in which we'll typically get this break is by at some point playing knight h5. And it's very convenient in this variation that the bishop is on f4 because it creates an opportunity for us to gain a tempo on it. If they take the pawn, we get queen f6, and these positions, this is white's best option to grab the pawn after this, but nonetheless, black does get some compensation in some positions like these with a fair amount of control over the dark squares. A move which really allows us to show off the whole f5 plan is if white, say, doesn't want to grab the d6 pawn, but instead retreats, which would allow black to get in the break we were just talking about, f5, and of course they can't take because in some other lines, as we saw, the bishop on e3 is a bit vulnerable tactically on the square, not being defended. Which means that, say, if white now plays queen d2, and of course this is a threat now because the bishop is defended, we're not going to take on e4, because then this is going to get very dicey, the pawn on d6 is incredibly weak. Rather, what we will do is after queen d2, we're going to play this move f4, and the bishop is really overloaded. It can't take because then they're going to hang a knight on d4, so rather what they're going to do is instead probably something like bishop f2, but after bishop e5, black really has a nice bind in the position, the d6 pawn, even though it can be weak in some variations, the bishop on e5 really protects it very excellently. And what this bishop also does is it kind of eyes the g3 square, and you might be thinking like, Sam, how is that really relevant, right? But it kicks in when we look at, say, a variation such as this one, where we can actually play knight g3 check anyway despite the pawn defending that square because, okay, one, this is a fork, and two, if we take, well now this is all of a sudden a threat, and that's looking incredibly dangerous. But also one thing worth noting is that you might be tempted then to sort of try and play something like knight h5 immediately without the bishop on f4 and try to get an f5 like this, I don't know. But one thing I want to caution you about in doing this is that very often in these sorts of positions, white can actually play this move g4, which might look weakening, and you might be happy to retreat and say that, oh, well, white's weakened their position a lot, I don't really care. And while that may be true under some circumstances, in many, you've also just wasted a lot of time moving the knight back and forth, and this move g4 can actually serve white to be useful in some lines. And one very cool idea, actually, this is pretty high level stuff, actually, is that this line's kind of refuted, I believe, due to some knight f5 sacrifice further down the line, where if we ever take it, they play g takes f5 to get the open g file, and they sort of murder us. So with some of the good news out of the way about the open structure, I have to break some bad news to you guys, which is that you have to be very, very careful when you do enter such a structure, because if you're not, very often you run sort of long-term strategic risks, because again, say, we have some moves such as the following, where black eventually takes on d4, not that that was forced, but sometimes they do act in such a way, where because you have to understand that unless black gets in d5 under favorable circumstances, very often there will sort of be this long-term, once again, space disadvantage they are coping with, which if they don't handle skillfully could potentially end up quite badly in the long run. And this game is a very good example of that, where black sort of gets in what I would call a bit of a bind, where they sort of just end up being very planless. They're just very passive and sort of waiting for white to call all the shots, and say knight c5 in this position, queen d2, a5, rook a d1. And now there's actually a very common tactical idea which is present on the board, and you should be very careful of if you ever play this position, both from the white and black perspective, because now what black often likes to do in such positions is push their a-pawn forward, play queen a5, maybe slide the queen to b4. We're going to get more on that later. But basically, black is going to play in such a way that they will try and generate some play on the queen side. However, if they do that immediately in this position, you might even want to try and pause the video and figure out what white's below is. But basically, the problem is if we play knight takes c6, we're actually just winning the pawn, because when black recaptures, we take, and it might even be more than the pawn because we're threatening to win this, and if they take, well, bye-bye to however much material they're losing. I mean, they're down in exchange on the pawn, so probably not so great for them, right? Which is why in the present game, in order to avoid that tactic, black played knight fd7 to protect the knight c5, since now something like this would obviously not work. You could even take the pawn, but knight, whatever, that all works. Which is why in the game, instead of going for any bullshit like that, white instead played more prophylactic manner, taking into account the fact that now black is really threatening to go something like a4. It's not really a threat as in like white's going to be screwed, but more so threat in the sense that black is just going to slowly improve their position and just put a little bit of pressure on us, which could be potentially unpleasant. So that's why in this game, a relatively strong 2600 GM played this move b3, and the whole point is just to stop actually black from playing a4, very typical idea, because now what we're going to do is to play b4, and kick this knight out of the c5 outpost, which very often is secured once again by the pawn beyond a5. So you always have to be careful about pushing this guy, because then b4 is going to come the next move. But of course, we had to play b3. You couldn't just wait for a4, because like, I don't know, if we did something like this, then they would get en passant, and it just wouldn't quite be the same. But after b3, this is, again, the bind I was talking about. Black just doesn't have a clear plan. A4 doesn't work, B4, if they go F5, well, we can just take that very securely. So they're more or less just sort of left to their own devices, just sort of fiddling around, waiting to see what does white do, so that I can really do something. So they started playing knight f8, but unfortunately just didn't really lead anywhere, and they were just in a very passive position. Just playing a bunch of waiting moves that I was sort of discussing they would do. Knight a4, hitting the b6 pawn now, rook a6. Not a move they want to play, but sort of a move they have to at this point. Knight ec3, rook e6, very another just awkward move, sort of defending the d6 pawn, I suppose, in some lines. f4, knight c5. And yeah, black's position was really just cracking now after bishop h3. And with the bishop just eyeing along this diagonal, pressuring the rook, forcing him to sort of move out of the way, this is all just sort of going to hell. Providing a bit of a counterexample to that, however, though, it's not all bad news like in this structure. There are some times, even when you don't get in, say, the d5 or the f5 break, even if you do get into this more slow type of position, if you are able to get the sort of counterplay I was talking about earlier really underway, then it can actually, even though the engine will very often still say, as it often does in the King's Indian, that white is objectively better, black often does have practical chances, as in this game we saw here. So this was a fianchetto variation, by the way, a very, there's a couple of different options black has when they face it. They could go for c5, trying to aim for some sort of Benoni type position. Very often though, white will keep the tension, and this sort of leads to its own different position. Either you can take here and get this sort of position, or you go knight c6 and then get this symmetrical structure, or this sort of thing happens, and this is a very interesting position actually. Or you can go say knight c6, go for a quick a5, or even say a6, rook b8, b5, or even as a final thing, potentially go c6. And this is a bit of a tricky move that can lead to a couple different types of positions, but knight b7 nonetheless is what happened in the game. And there are various different ways to play these sorts of positions, but generally speaking, what's going to happen at some point is, okay, maybe black's going to wait a little bit by playing moves such as c6. It's a very common move to play in these sorts of positions, but also very common is to eventually at some point play e takes d4, and voila, we finally get the open structure. And it's a little bit different to the last position we looked at, because the bishop is on this diagonal instead of this one, and so I think the plans we're going to show here do work a little bit better. For one, because of the fact that the c4 pawn is undefended, and we're going to see how that manifests in the next few moves as we keep following this game. Knight fd7, rook a d1, a4, and we really got the counterplay going with queen a5, knight b6 in the next moves. Queen b2 is going to come, sorry, not queen b2, queen b4 rather. And this is sort of the whole thing we were aiming for, right? We build up the pressure on the c4 pawn, we force white to defend that with b3, we exchange pawns, queen b4, and this is a really key thing I want you to take note of. Whenever white plays b3 and we take, they lose a lot of queenside mobility or flexibility, you could say, because from here on out, it's not possible, like, say, maybe in this position, right, they have dreams of further advancing these queenside pawns slowly up the board, but of course, once these pawns are being exchanged, that is no longer really a possibility. The b3 pawn is something that needs to be babysitted now. Not really a fun scenario for white to really find themselves in. And the game actually wrapped up fairly quickly, not black winning, but in a perpetual, or threefold repetition, I should say, after f5, and they sort of eyed the black queen, and it's difficult to really avoid this sort of thing. This can happen occasionally, but it was also possible for black to immediately put pressure on the b3 pawn and do something like this, which would actually put white in a bit of a tight corner. And I'm not sure whether the players in this game saw it or not, but basically white's only move is knight b5, when the idea is if you take, well, bishop d2, and bye-bye our queen. So what we sort of got to do is we got to play rook takes b3, which will allow knight takes d6, and this position is quite interesting, it's quite imbalanced. But I guess in this game, since black was a bit lower rated, they didn't want to keep the game going any longer, they just wanted to keep it simple and allow the sort of draw. Getting into the final section now, we're going to be tying up some loose ends. This is going to be on a couple of miscellaneous ideas in the King's Indian, which nonetheless I think you should know. And the first one we're going to be discussing is not really going to be a concrete plan like some of the others we're going to be discussing later. It's more of a broad, ever-present theme in the King's Indian, which is really the power of the bishop on g7. And it's sort of like, well, no shit, Sherlock. Of course, sometimes the bishop's going to be quite powerful, but I really want to show some very powerful examples to really highlight this point and drive home for some of you guys. And so the first one is going to be arising via the Makarganov variation, where white plays h3. And similar to some of the other variations we discussed earlier, very often at some point what white's going to do, they're going to play g4 and sort of clamp down the king side once again. Okay, we see the moves knight a6, bishop e3, knight h5. It is possible for white actually to play just g4 in this position immediately, but nonetheless, did not happen in the position we're going to look at. Knight h5, queen d2, knight c5, let's say. And one thing you would need to understand in this position is that although g4, it sort of fits in with white's setup, right? It looks very natural, and you might be thinking, okay, I need to look at knight f6, how do I defend the pawn? Maybe like queen c2 or something. I don't know, I want to give up my light square bishop like this, so okay, yeah, maybe I will play like this. You're actually thinking the completely wrong way. Black's not going to play knight f6, they're just going to play knight f4, and you might be thinking, but Sam, I'm going to win a pawn. You're kind of stupid. And unfortunately, this is a very common way, maybe minus the Sam is stupid part, way of thinking about these sorts of positions. Just like, oh, I'm up a pawn, what's there to worry about? But unfortunately, what you have to worry about is really everything as white now, because you put all your pawns on light squares, then you gave up your dark squared bishop. Black has a bishop here. The bishop is also, not only did they give up their dark squared bishop, but they opened our bishop on this diagonal, and now it's cruising along here, which really means this position, actually, if we turn the engine, is already like -2, -3, which in human terms basically means white is screwed and black is winning, precisely because we have this move actually in this position where we can play f5 and really blow everything up. Also make use of the fact that white's incredibly behind development, the king's still in the center. Again, we have the bishop here to utilize, so if they were just to exchange a bunch of pawns, this would be pretty much suicidal. And again, what this all just really highlights is how in all of these positions, this bishop on g7 is so incredibly important. Even though it's sort of locked in the pawn chain for now, it might look like it has very little potential long term. It can actually be quite the opposite, but many players forget about this and they just start thinking like, oh, free pawn, but that, again, not how you want to be thinking about these sorts of positions. And another cool mini example to really drive this sort of theme home, this was a game Rajava played against some grandmaster whose name I can't remember right now. My apologies for that, but nonetheless what Rajabov did in this game was he played this very instructive move, e4, and the material is equal, right? But he basically was like, okay, well, what's going to do next? They're going to bring a knight in e4, they're going to lock my bishop in for the rest of the game, and this guy with all of my pawns on dark squares pretty much in the position has absolutely no way he's going to get out. I don't really like how this is looking, so let's change the circumstances a little bit, stir things up with e4, and actually the engine evaluates this as the best move, only a little bit better than doing any other random move in the position, because, you know, the engine being the engine says this is just a dead draw, and fair enough, it does have drawish tendencies, but definitely the most ambitious way to play the position is to play e4, really maximize the most out of our bishop on this diagonal, and he ended up stirring some counterplay up on the queen side. His opponent tried to temporarily sacrifice a pawn back, but nonetheless his rooks got very active, and we can just see long-term how this is going to pan out with very good bishop against sort of mediocre knight, right? But now getting into some more meaty plans. One variation that we talked about earlier, right, was the fianchetto. We looked a little bit at how black can play knight b7 and e5. Another common plan which black can go for actually is to put the knight in c6. And say after knight c3 in this position they can go for, they can actually still go e5, and this is something which I believe theoretically is even a bit better. However, one other very popular plan, although it's theoretically not considered as strong these days, is to go for what we'd call the panel attack with a6, rook b8, and then b5. And in doing this, we are basically trying to destabilize the white queen side in some sense. You can imagine, like, from a positional point of view, quite simply, like, if we can trade off our b pawn for the white c pawn, which occupies more space in the center, that's probably going to be favorable for us. And so that's why for a long time against the fianchetto variation, this was considered one of the best ways that black could play. These days, again, less so, but nonetheless it's important to be acquainted with these ideas across various variations of the King's Indian. Another line in which this can occur actually is also the same variation in this position where white plays f3. And although sort of the main line after bishop e3 these days is probably considered to be c5, playing the style of the Benoni, where very often white will play d5 advancing. Again, we get this Benoni structure, or they'll play like knight e2, and then after knight c6, d5, knight e5. By the way, you might be wondering, is that not a free pawn? And sort of yes and no. Like, for a long time it was considered that c5 wasn't so good because it was thought that, you know, white could just trade queens off, get into the pawn up ending and just sort of chill out. But then eventually there were some people who started questioning, like, is this position all it's cracked up to be? White's a bit behind development, and after knight c6 and doing some concrete stuff, it turns out black is not doing too bad at all. Which again is why people most of the time these days will be either knight e2 or d5 against these Benoni structures. But getting back to the point, the panel attack can also occur in this variation of the same image, which would occur after knight c6, knight e2, a6, and say like queen d2, rook b8, where we again are going to go for b5. And the important thing I want to highlight, the common theme between the same image and the fianchetto variation, the one we just discussed here, right? Why does the panel plan work in these variations while it doesn't work in many variations, I should note, such as like the classical? Why is it that we can go for this sort of thing here? And there are kind of two main reasons as to why. One is just that with the bishop, okay, in the same image being blocked off at the moment, not covering this diagonal, it makes b5 a lot easier to get in, whereas if you can imagine the knight being on f3 instead, this diagonal would be open, again, it would be very difficult to get b5 in. Or if we're speaking about the fianchetto variation, again, the bishop is on this diagonal, not covering the b5 square, which is why the panel plan also works in that line. Another reason is also that, say if we looked at the classical variation, again, we just played moves such as knight c6. What white is usually going to do in this sort of position is to play d5, kicking the knight away, and it doesn't really have any good squares. If we go to a5, we get kicked around b4, and knight's actually trapped. And if we go instead, say, e5 in this position, well then we invite double e pawns, and some people play this way, but I don't think it's that good, which pretty much then leaves going back to b8. Naturally, some people play like this, it's not that stupid, but it's also probably not that good if I'm being honest. Whereas say if we compare this to something like the fianchetto variation, well, if d5 we're not going to go knight e5, but we can go knight a5, and compared to, say, the classical variation, again the c4 pawn's undefended, so they can't play b4 because knight takes c4 just wins a pawn. And sure, white can maybe prepare this with something like knight d2, and now we'll go b4 next or something. We can always play c5 and prevent b4, and if they take, then we can bring our knight back to safety. And in the same edge variation, it's sort of similar. Like if they go d5, well, not quite a5 because b4 again traps the knight, but this time we're going to go to e5. And if they, well, okay, first of all, they don't have a knight in f3 to exchange it, and if they go f4, then knight g4, and we're sort of gaining a lot of tempi here, so this can be justified, allowing our knight to be kicked around the center like this. But just briefly touching again the same image, one idea I want to highlight and point out is that, say if they go knight c1 in this position, this is a common thing that will happen. They'll now cover the b5 square, so we can't play this really, but what we can do is we can make use of the fact that they've sort of played a bit of a passive move with knight c1. However, now after we play e5 instead, switching away from playing the queen side to playing in the center, hitting the d4 square, which again their knight, given that it moved to a more passive square, it's not an e2 controlling that one. If they now go for something like d5, knight d4, they can challenge the knight with something like knight b3 and then go for this sort of position, but they can't easily just take the knight like they would like to, because again, well, this opens bishop up on this diagonal. We're a pawn down temporarily, but that's quickly going to be solved by none other than knight takes e4, since if they play queen takes e4, rook e8, and we are winning their queen. Another plan that might look somewhat similar to the one we just discussed, it's going to involve sort of the b5 break, is that In some lines, let's put this Miscellaneous variation on the board as this one where white doesn't put their pawn on e4. Most lines in the King's Indian, white will do this, but there are some exceptions such as one in this Miscellaneous, where white's going to aim for more of a slow positional game and is okay with occupying less space in the center. This is quite interesting. I actually played it a couple of weeks ago. Not bad at all. But one thing that you do have to take into account when you play in such a way is that you do give your opponent a little bit more leeway to play with more freedom than they might otherwise be allowed to, say if they had a pawn on, say if white had a pawn rather, on the e4 square. For example, in this position, one plan that is quite viable is to go for a6, c6, castles, and b5. And again, the whole idea is strategically we're pretty cool with trying to exchange our b pawn for white c pawn. Is it equalizing necessarily in all cases? Probably not, especially against something, again, more sort of ambitious or mainstream like the classical variation. You're probably much better off going for something like e5, c5, knight a6, one of these lines. If you try to go for something like this against classical, with white's just big space advantage, it's going to backfire pretty quickly. It's worth noting that if white voluntarily exchanges a c-pawn like this, wouldn't be so great, but if they just continue charging ahead forward, keeping the tension, increasing the pressure on black's position, this can get rather unpleasant rather quickly for the not white pieces, but rather the black pieces. And again, I feel like I'm becoming a broken record at this point, but similar to the last idea we just discussed, this one is sort of similar, but much cooler in my opinion, which is that sometimes there are going to be certain variations. Let's take this image, for example, where we're going to whip out a very quick b5 at the cost of some material, however. This is one such example where we go a6, bishop e3, and we saw the Pano sort of plan where you can go, or variation where you go rook b8, b5. But one sort of modern idea is to go knight bd7 actually, and after queen d2, go b5, stacking a pawn. And it's somewhat in the style of the Benko Gambit, where we sort of get all these open files on the queen side. But although that is cool, that's not really our idea to play there. It's a little bit slow in this whole variation. What we're going to do is actually play c6, e5 and strike against the center and try to open things up with many lines d5 actually. Say for example like knight g3 d5, which works very well because in the same image of course, like, you know, when they move their pawn like this, of course they're making it so that they're playing in a very special way in a sense, in that they have some very ambitious strategic goals, but concretely of course they are sacrificing development to some extent, and this line really just aims to sort of outline that and hence exploit it. And also I should note, in this position, you might be wondering, Sam, what happens if d5? You can actually go knight b6, a very swift move in this position, putting some pressure on the d5 pawn, but also very importantly, what we are doing is running knight c4, and that's very important because if we can win the darks with bishop in these sorts of positions, that strategically is going to be very annoying for the white pieces to grapple with. And if they prevent that with something like, I don't know, knight g3, then we can take and go bishop b7, put pressure on the d5 pawn, and they might be compelled at this point to once again give their dark sword bishop up, which they, again, don't really want to do. And just to show this isn't necessarily a one-off fluke, another variation which can occur is similar to the same image, knight ge2, castles, and they could transpose to a same image with f3, which is why I was saying it's similar, but say they can go knight g3, just omitting completely any f pawn moves, making then find gold very happy. But one cool idea that black can pursue is h5 in this position, trying to immediately kick the knight out on g3. And white usually has two options. One is they either retain the knight on the square by playing h4, but then it weakens like g4, for example, or they just comply and say, oh, okay, black, you can kick me back, that's cool, let's shake hands, agree for this for now. And then after h3, go g4, in hopes that they'll get some sort of position like e5, d5, and we sort of have some positions which look familiar to the ones we were discussing earlier. The h3 pawn is also arguably a long-term liability, but if instead of e5 we play in a much more energetic way, we can actually bust the position open and go b5, and the point being if knight takes b5, knight takes e4, and if this one we can play a6, and really we're just playing in such a way that like if we exchange all these pieces off and continue gain this initiative, we're really just continuing to exploit the fact that white's king is in the center, their kingside structure is kind of shit, their pieces are overall just very uncoordinated, and hence again that's why we can justify going for some sort of plan like this whole b5 gambit, because when things open up, it's going to reveal all of the ugly stuff in white's position. But now, moving away from more of like a very concrete, sharp, you know, trying to like absolutely tear white's head off sort of thing, we're going to be discussing more of a slow, very grindy type of structure, which could arise a lot earlier actually in the opening. Say if we go c5, d5, e5. This is a check Benoni, of course, where we get very often this sort of really locked pawn center, which the engine will very often say is like plus 1.5, plus 2, and to some extent I definitely agree with why it's objectively better in these positions, but to many players it's also not that easy to really handle. And so it's worth keeping in the back of your head when you play the King's Indian that you can't always just go for this sort of very locked center. Not always it's possible. Like for example, after castle's in this position, you probably want to wait for white to play something like d5, and if you really do like this very locked sort of pawn center, like you get in the check Benoni, probably after white plays d5, going c5 is more suitable, because if you go for, say, like, in this position, c5, then there's a couple of problems. Like, okay, if we go for an equivalent variation or version of the exchange line, well, pretty much the only thing that's changed is white has castled, and we've played c5 compared to, of course, the normal exchange variation. We've also weakened the d5 square dramatically compared to the normal versions. And this pretty much means, say, if we throw in a move like knight takes e5, takes, in the normal variations, this wasn't so bad, but this one is really ugly. Again, the c5 move being inserted makes this sort of a possibility. That could be a problem. Or even just something like bishop g5, just gain the tempo and a very quick initiative, could very quickly turn into something ugly for the black pieces, which is why, again, like, if you really want this sort of structure with c5, you just gotta hold off on it in this position. One way which you might be able to get is playing something like knight a6, and further down the line, I don't know if white plays d5 like this, now you can play something like c5 and get your sort of check Benoni structure. And of course, one of the advantages of going to this whole structure, I should say, is that because your pawn occupies a c5 square, not a c7 one, it does make it more difficult for white to really freely advance their queenside pawns. But at the same time, it does give a bit more of an easy target once they, say, get through a3, rook b1, b4 to sort of latch onto something, right? But yeah, I just thought the segment was worth throwing in here. Not the most common thing you're going to get in the King's Indian. Of course, depending on your style and preferences as a player, this could be something which happens in more of your games than someone else's, perhaps. And finally, on the note of check Benoni, we're going to be talking about Benoni structures in general in the King's Indian. We've seen a little bit earlier how sometimes, black will play c5 at various points. For example, like bringing this whole variation we discussed earlier, knight e6, g4, c5. We talked about how, white probably wants to avoid this if possible. But it's also common in many variations, say, like already in this position actually, for black to go c5, this is considered one of the main lines of the semi-averbakh variation. And it's just because many players don't like the variation, say they get off to e5. And these whole variations where very often sort of, Kingside's a bit locked up, we can't get in our favorite plans with f5 usually, so a lot of players sort of say, like, screw that, I'm just going to go c5 and go for the Benoni. And sort of the argument is that if we go a few moves deeper, we're going to get, because the bishops are on e2 and e3, was arguably a slightly subpar variation of some of the more mainstream lines. And granted, this is something that I played with the white pieces, so I don't think it's like immediate equality or anything like that. But nonetheless, I think it's quite important for a King's Indian player to not just be locked into playing like one sort of structure the whole time, like you only know to play e5, knight e8, f5 or some shit like that I've been saying a million times in this video. You really don't want to end up like one of those King's Indian players. A very important part of being a King's Indian player, at least in my opinion, is having the versatility and flexibility to play various types of structures. And of course, one of them very often is a Benoni, because naturally, the two main ways to challenge the d4 pawn is either by playing c5 or playing e5. Just so happens that very often c5 is a bit less strong than e5, but nonetheless it's something, again, that you should keep in the back pocket. And on that note, this is about going to wrap up this video, but if you're interested more in these Benoni structures, I had a video I released the other week. I think it was like 20 ideas every modern Benoni player must know. Even if you don't play the modern Benoni, even if you only play the King's Indian, that video is still going to be very useful to you. Go check it out. It's going to make playing the King's Indian a lot easier, in my opinion, if you ever get into these sort of Benoni structures. But with that being said, I hope you guys found the video useful. Please like, subscribe if you're not already for more content like this, and also check out my stuff in the description below. I offer coaching, I have a free newsletter, and there's also a Discord where you can talk to guys in the community around here about chess improvement, life, whatever, I don't care. But yeah, hope you guys all have a good day.